Hello everyone, and welcome to The Indie Ocean. A few weeks ago, the 2021 edition of the annual 7 Day Roguelike Game Jam occurred, and as with every other year, I did my best to play as many of the entries that caught my eye as I could. There were about 250 entries this year, I think, that declared themselves successes, of which I played about 70-ish. With some important caveats, which I will return to in a second. Now, everyone likes rankings and everyone likes lists, so I thought I would do a top 10 of my picks for the best entries from the 7DRL this year. With the caveat that I mostly didn't play games that are only available in the browser, because I personally have a pathological aversion to playing games in the browser. I just don't like it, and I can't really justify why. So I mostly didn't play games that were only available as browser games, with a couple of exceptions, one of which notably appears in this list. I'm going to stay away from the whole wearisome debate as to what is and is not a roguelike. If you frequent places like the Roguelike subreddit, then you'll have come across this debate and know how tedious and cyclical it is, so we're not going into that. For the purposes of this list, all that matters is that it was submitted to the Roguelike Game Jam, and it's enjoyable enough that I had enough fun with it for it to be one of my top 10. Simple as that. There is at least one game in this list that I personally don't consider to be a roguelike, but we're not concerned with that here. We're concerned with fun. So, without any further preamble, actually, a little bit further preamble. I want to point out that the ranking of the games here is of no particular significance. I don't feel powerfully that number 7 is better than number 8. They're all pretty good. Up until the top 3 or 4. Let's say the top 3, which I feel are definitely the top 3. So, with that preamble out of the way, here are my top 10 games from this year's 7 Day Roguelike Challenge. Enjoy.
Number 10. Dungeon Tetris. This is an entry by Numeron Reactor, who has submitted a few 7DRL entries over the years, most of which I've played, if not all. And you can always rely on Numeron to provide a game which has a distinctive sort of graphical style to it. But they do vary quite widely in the way that they play. But this one is probably the most divergent from the usual style of Numeron games that I've played. This one, as the name suggests, tries to incorporate dungeon crawling and Tetris, and it's not the last time that you'll come across that idea in this list. It was actually a bit of a theme among some of the games that I played this year. There were at least 3, if not more, games that tried to incorporate Tetris into dungeon crawling. But none of the other ones I played did it like this. The way that Dungeon Tetris attempts this idea is to have fairly standard roguelike gameplay, although streamlined in that it has hotkeys to activate single-use items rather than convoluted item identification systems and hunger clocks and those kind of tropes that are common to roguelikes. So it's pretty streamlined, but plays essentially like a roguelike. Procedurally generated layout, enemies popping up all over the place, bump combat, some ranged combat. But it adds in descending, well, from the point of view of the player, descending blocks. But logistically, they're basically pieces of ground where you need to build bridges, essentially, to cross otherwise impassable spaces, lakes and such like, using these Tetris-shaped blocks which descend from the top of the screen. But I guess from the point of view of the character, that would be coming forward from ahead of you. But you have to do both things at the same time. Now, it is turn-based in a roguelike style, so you don't have a time pressure on doing this, but manipulating the block that's approaching you does pass a turn. So if you're moving the block, you can't be fighting or moving yourself at the same time. So there's always this tension between needing to fight or evade attacks and needing to move forwards on one hand, and on the other hand, needing to actually build the land for you to move across. So it's a pretty tense and demanding game, and that's really my only major criticism with it, that it's so difficult. Even on the easiest of the 2 difficulty settings it has, it's incredibly difficult. The footage that I recorded for this video is by far the furthest I've managed to get into the game. Now, there is some kind of dungeon or tomb or something, according to the opening preamble at the beginning of the game, but I've never even got anywhere close to it. Usually I struggle to get past the first crossing, the first lake, at the beginning of the game. In this attempt that I played here, I think I crossed 3, maybe. But I still haven't even set eyes on this dungeon, let alone actually got into it and tried to tackle it. So it is a very, very difficult game, even on the easy setting. Having said that, getting a game finished in a week is a tough enough challenge as it is, without having to try and spend time on difficulty balancing and things. So I'm inclined to be a bit lenient with games that don't pitch the difficulty perfectly when they're in a time-limited jam like this. But that's why Dungeon Tetris appears at the bottom of this top 10 list, because it is just too difficult. But worth a play for the really bizarre and unusual gameplay, if nothing else. Number 9. Endgame 437. I'm not really sure what that title refers to. It doesn't seem to relate to anything that's actually going on in the game. So I don't know if it's just, this is something that sounds like the title of a game, let's use that. But regardless, this one turned out to be more fun than I initially thought it was going to be. When I started playing it, it wasn't really clear to me what was going on. You start off in an area which is kind of a hub, as it turns out. It has a shop and something fantastically called the Maze of Experiences, both of which give you the chance to get extra stuff. The Maze of Experiences is the best one because you use experience points that you gain from battling enemies to access permanent upgrades to things like your ammunition capacity, your torch capacity, stuff like that. But it wasn't clear initially what was going on, so I just sort of wandered around for a while and eventually figured out what was happening. Essentially, you're meant to find 4 keys, which you use to open 4 doors, which lock the final dungeon. As you find the keys, you'll gradually unlock the route into the final dungeon, and then go into the dungeon and find the thing that you're meant to be retrieving, the name of which eludes me right now. It's a golden something, which has been stolen, and you're getting it back. The thing that makes this interesting is it's surprisingly arcadey for something that's very much a turn-based roguelike. You have very, very limited capacity at the start of the game. As I say, you can buy upgrades, which will give you a bit more flexibility and breathing room. But to begin with, you only have 2 shots at a time in your gun. You only have 2 spaces in your inventory for things like ammo refills and torch refills. If your torch goes out, then your view range is dramatically reduced, and that causes problems because you will start taking hits from enemies that can see you, but you can't see them. So you need to maintain your ammunition, your torch, and you also need to have the option of carrying health replenishing items, possibly, if you're taking hits, and the keys that you're looking for, which will take up one of your precious inventory slots. So it starts off quite tight and quite limited, But the more you fight, the more of the permanent upgrades you're able to get from the Maze of Experiences. It's hard to describe why this game works, because it's so simple. You just go into the 4 areas, and then eventually the final area, walk around, find the keys, leave. Ideally, fight some things along the way so that you can unlock some permanent upgrades. It sounds really, really basic, but there's something about it that works well. I think maybe it's the requirement to be economical. So whenever you encounter enemies, of which there are many, you have to stop and think carefully about whether it's worth you spending a bullet to attack them from a distance, or whether you want to try and maneuver closer. And I think all of the enemies have ranged attacks, so if you're going to try and get in close, you have to be really careful about exposing yourself to attacks from the other enemies in the area. And it all just feels really, really tight, yet at the same time somehow sort of speedy and fast-paced. Obviously, it's not my favourite game from the Jam, because it's not at the top of this list, but it was definitely a surprise hit for me. I wasn't keen on it to begin with, but as I started to get a feel for how it works, I was surprisingly taken with this one. So that's Endgame 437.
Number 8. The distressingly named Poog.
That name is basically Pool Rogue, because it's a roguelike based around pool, but I can't help seeing that title as Poo Rogue, a roguelike based around poo. But don't worry, it's not that, at least as far as I've got in the game so far. It's a dungeon crawl done through the medium of pool. And this is the game which is, for me, the least like what I consider a roguelike, but as I said at the top, I'm not interested in discussing definitions of roguelikes here. The game basically treats each pool table as a room of a dungeon. So you move from room to room as a ball, you're the cue ball, you move from room to room, and each time you enter a room it's a new pool table with a different layout, sometimes obstacles dotted around, different numbers of pockets. And enemies appear as other balls. A lot of the balls are just straightforward and will roll at you and try to bump you into the pockets. But occasionally they have a special power. The one that I keep seeing is one which sort of bends gravity. You'll see it in this video clip here at some point, where if you launch yourself on a trajectory that goes sort of within the gravity well of this ball, it will bend you away. So I guess sort of inverse gravity. And it has that effect on enemy balls as well. There are also bosses. So far, every boss I've fought has been the same boss, just with slightly increased difficulty each time. But as with various other shortcomings of 7DRLs, I'm willing to cut it some slack for that based on the fact that the game was made in a week. The game is a lot more fun than I feared it would be. Initially I thought it was going to be a horrible gimmick, and it was basically going to be just a pool game with maybe procedurally generated ball positions or something. But it does actually work as kind of a dungeon crawl. It doesn't have an inventory, it doesn't have spells or special items or anything like that, so it is a very limited interpretation of a dungeon crawl, but it does work, and it's surprisingly enjoyable to play. I feel like the game is maybe not super well optimized, because it sometimes hangs for a surprising number of seconds when an enemy ball needs to take a turn. And it seems a little resource intensive. But again, it's a 1 week jam, so I will excuse that. But it works pretty well. Bouncing around the tables feels pretty good. You know, it does feel like a pool game. It seems to have appropriate ball physics and whatnot. and actually doing battle with the other balls, trying to bump them into pockets while not dropping yourself into pockets at the same time, works pretty well. And I quite like the boss fight format, which I will not spoil for you in case you play this yourself. I might show a little brief bit of footage here just so you can see what it looks like, but I don't want to spoil anything about how to battle it. But I will say that the boss does boss-like things, you know, it spawns minion balls and that kind of thing. Spawn minion balls doesn't sound like what's actually happening here. It's basically just summoning cannon fodder enemies. But of course, everything in this game is balls. So, yeah, it all works surprisingly well. It's not an amazing game in its current format, but it is a fun little venture, and it's actually one that I would like to see more done with. I would like to see this fleshed out into a bigger game with more enemy types, some different bosses, maybe even a way to activate abilities of some sort. I think there's potential here, but even in its current limited form, it's a fun little play worth checking out. Number 7. Rogue Meteor. This one is just a really solidly executed roguelike. It doesn't do anything particularly innovative, mechanically speaking, but what it does do is mostly really solid, and it's elevated by having a pretty nice presentation. It has this whole faux CRT look to it, to simulate playing on an older TV or monitor. And I quite like the whole sort of bleak exploring an abandoned space facility thing, which is done pretty well here. It's also quite referential. There are facehuggers in here, and you'll find logs lying around. That is, like text logs, not bits of tree, which have fun little sort of nudges at a dystopian society and out-of-control rampaging capitalism. So it's just really well done for the most part. The reason it's not higher up the list, though, is because I've had a few runs ended by me just not finding any oxygen. This is another game where resources are really tight. You have a limited supply of oxygen, a limited supply of ammunition whenever you find a projectile weapon. It seems like melee weapons maybe wear out or something causes them to be destroyed because they occasionally disappear from my inventory. I haven't figured out yet whether it's a weapon durability thing or whether maybe there are enemy attacks that cause you to drop your weapon or something. I'm not clear on that, but something causes them to vanish occasionally. And some weapons don't use ammunition as such, but they do draw upon your energy reserves, which are also very limited. So it's another one where managing your resources carefully is important. But I have had a few runs where my oxygen has just been going down as I've been moving around, and I haven't found a single source to replenish my oxygen, which becomes frustrating because then your run is being ended by something you had no control over. So that's the main reason it's not higher, because it's a bit of a crapshoot as to whether any given run is even doable or not. And it's a frustrating experience when you start to realise that you're just not going to find anything that will save you, through no fault of your own. But it is generally a solidly made game, plays pretty well, and I like the visual effect where you actually see the dice rolls playing out next to your character whenever you're performing attacks. That's a nice touch. Mechanically doesn't affect anything, of course, but it's a nice little aesthetic touch. And I do quite like the retro pretend CRT thing going on with the visual style. So that's Rogue Meteor. Just works pretty well as a fairly straightforward, solid little roguelike. Number 6. Know Thyself Roguelike. I always find it a little bit odd when a game which isn't related to anything else and doesn't have a non-roguelike form has roguelike in the name. It makes sense with something like Doom the Roguelike, where it's taking inspiration from another property, a non-roguelike property. It makes sense to specify that, but this game exists only in this form, so it could just have been called Know Thyself. But that's beside the point. The premise of Know Thyself Roguelike seems to be to explore your own mental state, but it doesn't really specify anything beyond that, and you wouldn't really know that from the game itself. So it's kind of immaterial. But the core mechanical premise of the game is the reason it's on this list. The exploration part of it, wandering around procedurally generated sort of dungeon rooms, battling enemies with bump combat and occasionally finding other things, is all fairly standard for the most part. But the way that your character develops and accesses special powers is done through these sort of tablet fragments. You start off with one complete tablet. I forget what they're called in the game. They might be runes or something like that. I think it's runes. But anyway, you start off with one complete one of these, made up of two halves, and each half is a different element of the power. So, the left half of the tablet is the criteria by which you gain charges to activate the power, and the right half of the tablet is the effect of the power and how many charges it needs. So you will get something like, on the left, you will gain one charge per action, one charge per move, per turn passed in the game. And on the right, when you reach 50 charges, you gain 5 health. So each time you reach this threshold of charges, a power activates. There are assorted variations on these. There are powers that damage enemies around you, or permanently buff your stats, or increase your sight distance, which causes the camera to zoom out, which is a little unsettling the first time it happens. And the way that you accumulate energy ranges from quite straightforward things like 1 energy per turn up to slightly more involved criteria like spending so many turns without taking damage. So there are assorted variations on this, and generally the more difficult the criteria are to fulfill, the more charges you'll get in one go. And when you start the game, you have a random combination of two halves, so you don't know what ability you'll have available to you at the outset. But as the game goes along, you gain more half tablets, sometimes just from descending to the next floor, and sometimes you get them from defeating enemies. And at a single location in each level, you can switch up these combinations of tablets, so you can swap around the halves that you have to suit what you think is the most beneficial way to use these abilities. And that's really what the game is about. And it works pretty well. I mean, some combinations are definitely more powerful than others, but that's fine. It doesn't need to be perfectly balanced. And I think it's an interesting enough mechanic that it makes the game worth playing. I also quite like the aesthetic. I wasn't sure about it at first because it's very dark, but I quite like the way it's slightly surreal and dreamlike, which I suppose is a reflection of this idea that you're meant to be inside your own mind. It reminds me a little bit of a sort of JRPG style indie game that I played recently called Helix, which was very surreal. It reminds me a little tiny bit of that, in that there's no attempt at realism here and sort of realistic styles of monsters and things. They're all odd things like pairs of grasping hands, stuff that's very figurative and metaphorical. So I actually quite like that. It's a fairly simple aesthetic, but it works here, I think. And that core mechanic is what lands the game on this list. So that's Know Thyself Roguelike. Number 5, The Winding Paths Below. First off, I like that title. It's a nice evocative title. More importantly, this is one of the games I mentioned earlier when I said there were a few games in this year's 7DRL that try to incorporate Tetris into procedurally generated dungeon crawling. So we've seen Dungeon Tetris already. This is another one, and there's one that didn't make the list called Duntris, which actually does this idea quite similarly to this game. Duntris didn't make the list. I did consider it, but it didn't make the list based on the fact that it's too easy to get yourself into an inescapable situation. The Winding Paths Below avoids that. So basically, in each level you're trying to get to the exit, and the way that you do it is by creating the floor of the level you're on using Tetris pieces. And when you put down a piece of floor that connects your current location to another square that has something on it, you will move onto the Tetris piece and then encounter the stuff that's adjacent to that piece. Starting off with fights and then other pickups after that. And that order of activation is important, because you might put down a floor piece which it puts you adjacent to an enemy and a healing item, but you need to have enough health to take out that enemy first, because the battle will trigger before the healing item does. And it's entirely deterministic, that apart from the generation of the shapes of the floor pieces. Things like combat are entirely deterministic. It's a straight trade-off. The enemy will do so much damage to you, and you will destroy it. And each time you destroy an enemy, you get so many experience. And when you get enough experience to gain the next level, you fully heal up. So manipulating that is, I've found, core to getting anywhere in this game. However, just getting off each dungeon level isn't the point, because it won't be long until you reach a stage in the game where you have to defeat a specific enemy on the level in order to unlock the exit. And as the enemies become more and more dangerous, that is, they inflict more and more damage on you, you have to be able to take that damage and survive. So it's a lot about battling as many enemies as you can to try and gain levels and thus increase your maximum health, but doing it in a way where you can always survive the battles. It starts off pretty easy, but it does get much trickier later on, and I think this format works pretty well. I found this game much more addictive than I was expecting to. I thought I would dabble in it for a few minutes, but it was one of those, I'll just give that another try kind of games. As I said, Duntris is in a similar vein to this, but where the Winding Paths Below allows you to rotate your Tetris pieces, Duntris doesn't. So it's entirely possible to place the floor pieces in such a way in Duntris that you then don't have room to put down the next one that comes out. It's possible to do that in the Winding Paths Below as well, but this game does allow you to overwrite parts of existing floor pieces at the cost of taking hits to your health in doing so. So it's much harder to get yourself into an inescapable situation in this game, which is why this one makes the list and Duntris does not. But feel free to check out Duntris as well for another interpretation of this idea done well. But it didn't make my top 10. This one did. This is the Winding Paths Below, and I had a lot more fun with this than I was initially expecting to. It's a really well executed interpretation of the Tetris dungeon idea. Number 4 is Idle Night. That's idle like a sculpture, not inactive. This one is strangely like a board game, playing board games is one of my other hobbies, and this reminds me of some abstract tactical games like Hive or Onitama. It also reminds me a little bit of a well-regarded Android roguelike called Hoplite. So in this game, you essentially control a piece on a board of hexagons, and there are several other pieces around which you need to destroy in order to open the stairs to the next level. It only has 5 levels, but each one is challenging enough that that's actually plenty to be going on with. It took me a little bit of figuring out, because I think the game doesn't really make it clear how anything works. You see, at the bottom of the screen you have a hand of cards, which display the abilities that are available to you. By default, the only ability you have, without the use of these cards, is to move. And you have 5 action points in each turn available to you. And how far you move determines how many points you use up. But of course, just moving will only accomplish so much, so you need these cards to activate so that you can use special abilities, which are things like attacks, or manipulating the position of the enemy pieces, or teleporting yourself around, assorted abilities like that. And what took me a while to get my head around was the fact that these abilities are available to you depending on where you stand on the board. Along the sides of the board are icons representing these abilities, and when you're in line with one of those icons, you have access to that ability. So at intersections of different icons, you will have multiple abilities open to you. And the same is true of the enemy pieces as well. So you have to pay attention to where not only your piece is, but where the enemy pieces are as well. Because you don't want to move into direct line of sight of an enemy piece if they're standing on a space where they have access to the bow, because they can just shoot you then. And this is a one-hit kill game. If an enemy piece manages to land a single hit on you, you are done. So it's a very, very positional-based game. And there's quite a lot to keep track of just in terms of which pieces have which abilities available to them. Luckily, it's easy enough to see that by just hovering your pointer over a piece, but still, there's quite a lot to hold in your attention. And for that reason, I'm not very good at it. I tend not to be a very strategic player, so this kind of game is tough for me, but it's done really, really well, and it's presented extremely well for a game that was made in a week. It's a very tough game, at least for me, but once you start to get your head around how you gain access to these abilities and the kind of ways that you can use them, then it really starts to come into its own as this very tactical, positioning-based game. And I've been having a lot of somewhat difficult fun with it over the last couple of weeks. So I can definitely recommend this one if you are into tactical board games, or you've played and enjoyed Hoplite. Or you just like the idea of this very positioning-heavy game. It's definitely worth a visit. That is Idle Night. Number 3. Beasts of Somewhere. I'm not sure how that's meant to be pronounced. Mehetia? Mehisha? Mehetia? I don't know what the pronunciation of that is. But this game is a very puzzly game which also manages to feel arcadey at the same time. It's another one which is surprisingly nicely presented for a project that was made in a week. So the idea here is you're trying to collect 4 pieces of this relic or artifact of some sort. I'm not entirely clear on why. And you just roam around the levels, keep descending, trying to find the bits. They seem to just occur at random every few levels, as far as I can tell. The thing is, though, that encounters with enemies are extremely dangerous. You have a courage stat, which is key to you actually fighting anything. You can fight an enemy with your courage fully depleted, but you will take damage in doing so. And you only start off with 1 or 2 HP anyway. At the beginning of the game, you choose one thing to be buffed. You either start with 2 HP instead of 1, or you start with 2 courage instead of 1, or you start with 2 inventory slots instead of 1. So depending on what you choose at the outset, you will have either 1 or 2 HP, which means 1 or 2 hits will kill you. So obviously taking a single hit is very bad in either case. Your courage is represented by a hand at the side of the screen. A fist, really, I suppose. And your courage point is spent when you land a hit on an enemy. So if there are any enemies which take multiple hits, which there are, if you only have 1 courage available to you, then it's going to be really difficult fighting them, because you can only land 1 hit in safety before you start taking damage as well. Your courage does recharge. It depletes when you attack. It does recharge, but only when you can't see an enemy. There is a mechanic here where you can cover your eyes, which drastically reduces your vision range, as you might expect, but makes it easier to recharge your courage. And one really nice, it's purely aesthetic, but one really nice little feature that I like is when your courage is recharging, the hand that represents your courage point counts down with its fingers how many turns are left to recharge. I just really like that small touch. It's that kind of aesthetic attention to detail which is really nice to see. You can gain permanent buffs as you play the game. If you're able to find a book, it will enable you to take 1 slot on this grid of abilities available in the bottom left of the screen, which are often things like an extra courage point, an extra HP, an extra inventory slot. But occasionally they're slightly more unusual things, like a disguise, which makes you more likely to sneak past enemies. So making use of your courage and the need to hide from enemies in order to recharge it is pivotal to this entire thing. And a lot of the time, you probably don't want to try and engage enemies. Particularly because the thing that really makes enemies dangerous is they can yell at you. And if you've ever been yelled at by a hostile monster, then you will know that, as this game depicts it, your courage will abandon you if someone yells at you, and you'll have to recharge it. So you can see when an enemy is going to yell. It flashes red just before it shouts. So that gives you a chance to get away or get in close and try to attack them. But you have to be really conscious of the possibility of enemies stripping away your courage before you even get to them. So it's very much about trying to manage having enough courage to land hits when you really need to. There's also a hunger clock which is tight enough to be a problem, but not so tight that you can't afford to make any mistakes with it. So you will need to replenish your fullness by eating food periodically. And some foods have extra effects. Some of them will heal you as well as topping up your hunger clock. But some of them will also do things like poison you or reduce your vision range, which is not great, but, you know, when you absolutely have to, then you will eat whatever you have on hand. So that's really all there is to it. Walk around, try to get enough food that you don't starve to death, try to find books if you can, and tackle monsters if you're courageous enough to do so and they don't scream at you before you get to them. But somehow the fact that the levels are so small kind of gives it an almost arcadey feel. Even though it's, again, turn-based. And it's a simple enough game that it's easy to get into, but it's definitely not easy to succeed at. So I can recommend this one, except if you have to try and say the name, which is more challenging than the game itself. Number 2, Pancake Theon. We're really getting into the best of the best territory here. Pancake Theon was very, very nearly number 1 in this list. I'll tell you in a second why it didn't quite make it. But this is a really, really well put together game. It's absurdly well presented for a game made in 7 days. It has real, proper, well-drawn visuals, and it has catchy music that's appropriate to the theme, and it's just very well put together. The theme is basically diners and food. Your character is an egg, as far as I can tell, wielding a spoon, and you need to explore 3 sort of small dungeon areas and find keys that lie within, and then you'll have a final challenge after you've done that. Each of the 3 areas is associated with a deity, a food deity, and these dungeons all look like diners, so they have checked tile floors and sort of food service themed surroundings, and all of the enemies are going to be food. You will see a lot of hostile toast in this game, but also some things like grapefruit, which I think is called grapefruit here, and those things are a pain. They're so tough. But anyway, you're an egg and you're fighting other food to try and get keys. But the reason it's called Pancake Theon, which is a terrible but also fun pun on Pantheon, I think, is these 3 deities. When you start the game, you'll need to choose one of them to align yourself with, and that will determine which ability you start the game with. There's a sort of area of effect attack. There's an ability that lets you take more actions in the same span of time, and there's a sort of ranged attack that lets you throw something at distant enemies and briefly poisons them. I think it's poison. Some kind of status effect, anyway. So you'll choose one of the deities at the outset, and they're all food related. And that will give you an ability. But then as you explore, you will also have the chance to gain more abilities, again associated with the different deities. And one of the things that's really charming here is the way that, almost Hades style, these different food deities will try to persuade you to align with them, but will also bicker with each other for your preference. When you're exploring and you come across one of the spots that lets you pick up a new ability, 2 of the deities will argue over which one of them gets to be the one you go with. So that just lends the whole thing a lot of charm, because they all have personality, and I mean, it's not complex, not like these are convoluted interactions, but it lends a lot of charm and personality to this game. Surprisingly, there are also Pancake Theon t-shirts available from the Super Try Games website, if you find yourself really taken with this game. Once I discovered that those existed, I couldn't resist ordering one, so I have an Egg Rogue t-shirt on its way to me. So, of course, one of the main things that you notice about this game is how well presented it is, and I've talked about that already, but it plays very smoothly as well. The abilities that you pick up are just hotkeyed to the number keys, so they're easy to use. Combat is a straightforward bump thing, but it feels satisfying to do. Enemies are all cute, but also dangerous, and it just works really, really well. My only significant criticism of this game is that it's short and also simultaneously easy. Now, this has been remedied. If you support Super Try Games on Patreon, there is a downloadable version of Pancake Theon available, which has a harder difficulty setting implemented. But for the 7DRL release, which is the one that's available if you don't support Super Try on Patreon, there's only the one easier difficulty setting, and it is too easy. I got through the game on my first attempt in about 10 to 15 minutes. Now, I'm not going to complain too much about that, because one, making a game in 7 days is difficult enough already. You need to expect it to be a short game, so I'm not going to lambast it for its brevity. And 2, I do tend to fall into the camp that if you're pitching the difficulty and you don't have a lot of time to really painstakingly refine it, you should err on the side of too easy rather than too hard. That's a personal preference thing. but I favour a game that leans too easy over one that leans too difficult. So this isn't a huge complaint, it's just a note that if you're going to play the 7DRL release of this game, it is short and it is on the easy side. This is also the one I mentioned at the top of the video, which is a browser game. The Patreon version is downloadable, so I snapped that up as soon as it was available. But the version that was released for this jam is playable only in the browser. But I have played some of Supertry's other games, notably Hack, although that's spelt with a Q, so mentally I always read it as Hake, but then that makes it sound like a fish. So your mileage may vary on pronunciation there. I think it's meant to be Hack. But I've played that game a bit and thought it was really well done, so I wanted to make sure I checked out their entry here, so I gritted my teeth and played it in the browser, and it was worth it. So that's why Pancake Theon almost makes number 1, because it is really good, but the jam version is a combination of short and easy, which just makes it not quite substantial enough. But that still puts it in at a very respectable number 2, and it is an extremely charming game. And the number 1 spot, coveted by every roguelike developer globally, the Indie Ocean's number 1 of the top 10 roguelikes from the 7DRL 2021. My number 1 pick this year is Starguy 4. And this one was a big surprise, because when I first played it, I was pretty indifferent to it. It felt awkward and cumbersome, and I didn't really understand what it was trying to do. But the more I fiddled with it, the more I started to get a handle for just how well made it really is. Like the other 2 games before it in this list, it's very well presented, especially for a 7-day game. It's not quite as lavish as Pancake Theon, but it still looks pretty good. It has a pretty decent visual style. But what's weird about Starguy 4, and takes some getting used to, is that while you're exploring this, I don't know, alien planet, asteroid, whatever it is, you rely very heavily on your projectile weapons, but you can only shoot left and right, even though it's a top-down game. So you can move in 4 directions, but you can only shoot in 2 of them, which is really strange when you first start playing. It feels very, very odd, but it works perfectly fine once you get used to it, because what it does is introduce this tactical consideration about how you want to approach enemies. Which enemies are easy enough to defeat that you're happy to approach them from above or below and bump them in melee and defeat them that way, and which ones are sufficiently dangerous that you want to make sure you get alongside them so you can shoot them with your very limited ammunition. So there's a lot of trying to conserve ammunition here, because you don't find a lot of it, and I've had some runs where I didn't find any replacement ammunition, which makes for a pretty harrowing experience. But you will typically find either ammunition or replacement weapons reasonably often in most runs. There's also a sort of grid of unlockable abilities or buffs which you can gain from certain locations that you will find along the way. They don't come up that often, but they have a pretty major effect when you do find them. You can also gain new activatable skills. You start off with the ability to roll a couple of spaces in one direction. Again, this seems to be only left and right. But you have 2 slots, so you can pick up a second one, and then if you find more, you can replace one of the ones you've already got. And some of these are more useful than others. The roll can be mildly useful if you're trying to get away from an enemy that's pursuing you, or trying to get past an obstructive enemy to the exit, but generally I don't use it that much. One I did get a lot of use out of was the one that creates a duplicate of yourself. I thought at first that was going to be just a passive decoy, but it seems to actually fight enemies as well, which makes it very, very useful. Some of the passives that you get from the grid of unlockable buffs work really well too. Some of them are just things like more health or inflicting more damage in melee, but there's one that leaves a trail of acid behind you, which I got a lot of enjoyment out of. So Starguy 4 generally plays really well once you start to get a handle on the weirdness of this horizontal-only attack thing. I don't know what the final objective of the game is. I assume there's something at the end of this sequence of levels, but I don't actually know what it is, and I don't really know what the premise of the game is, sort of setting and story-wise. But as with so many other things I've remarked on during this video, how much setting and story can you really expect from a game made in a week? So that doesn't bother me at all. The game is often pretty tough, but some runs will be easier than others, depending on whether you find a plentiful supply of ammo and other weapons. The toughest run I've had was the one where I didn't find any ammo or replacement weapons for quite a long time, so I was having to bash everything with my bare hands, and that is a hazardous proposition. But for the most part, you will find a fairly steady drip of projectiles to make use of. Some of the projectile weapons are better than others. You start off with a default pistol, but there are things like shotguns which have a spread, as you would expect. My personal favourite so far is the crossbow, because it's just really satisfying to use. It seems to do a load of damage, and there's something about the way it shoots really quickly with each shot that just makes it feel very satisfying to me. So Starguy 4 starts off feeling slightly awkward because of that quirk of only being able to shoot in two directions. But if you stick with it, it does start to reveal more and more tactical nuance and these extra abilities which give you more options for how you approach situations. And as you go along, once you get a few levels in, you start to see some weird and interesting looking enemies that are either big multiple tile things or sometimes enemies which seem to be made up of smaller enemies, which are really interesting to deal with. So there's not a lot in it between my top three choices here in terms of which one I think is the best. The top three are all really, really good games, and I would recommend all of them. But this one is my number one, Starguy 4. Or is it meant to be Starguy IV? Is he meant to be intravenously administered? Unclear. So, those were my picks for the top 10 games from this year's 7DRL challenge. Do you agree? Have you played any of them? Are there any that you would include in your personal top 10 that I didn't include here? Feel free to let me know politely in the comments. And if you would like some of my opinions on games that I didn't include in the list, I actually did very brief reviews of them in tweet form as I played through all the games that I played. So I will put links below as well to the couple of Twitter threads where I did that. So feel free to check that out if you want some opinions on games that I didn't include here. Thanks for watching, and until next time, bye for now.